Even at your house at work, but anytime, it's 9 months. What are you telling me? I don't know.
Welcome one and all. Hi, Mom.
Hi,
How you
Randy.
doing?
I'm doing good.
So welcome to tonight's class. We are continuing. This is the third class that has a little bit to do with the synagogue. It's going to be a change of pace starting with the lecture in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about the national diet. We're going to talk about kashrut. And we will, and then we have one more class in December about the so-called December dilemma. And then we'll be done for the year. Where did all the time go? Where did all the time go? So, but tonight we're going to talk about the Torah service, which is for many people the highlight of the. Whoops! Is everyone still here? I thought I accidentally pressed the kill button. Anyway, we're all still here. Going to talk about the Torah service, which for many people is the highlight of the synagogue service, and we're going to talk about Torah study as a lifelong Jewish vocation, a lifelong Jewish project, and we'll talk a little bit about getting started with that. So I will, as is always my custom, I endeavor to speak for 40 minutes, which will end up being probably closer to 50 minutes, and then we'll have some time for our unrehearsed conversation. Still have some people coming in, but we will go ahead and go. This is one of my favorite sayings from the Mishnah. When we, in the introductory class last summer, when we talked about the Mishnah, remember that the Mishnah is the compilation of the rabbis that written probably around the year 200. And there's a section of the Mishnah called Pirkei Avot, the chapters of principles. And this is just when rabbis, they give their best advice. And there's this saying, Ben Bagbag, who was a rabbi, said, turn it over and turn it over, for everything is in it, and look into it, and become gray and old therein. Do not move away from it, for you have no better portion than it. And what he is talking about is the study of Torah. And for Jews, the study of Torah, remember the Torah can refer to the first 5 books of Moses that we read in the synagogue. But for Jews, Torah is more expansive. It's our entire collection of literature, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the codes, philosophical books, chapters of mysticism. Anything that creeps into the canon is considered to be Torah. And the amazing thing about Torah is everything truly does make its way into it. As we spend our years, or we spend our life studying these texts, we realize that we are involved in a great project. And the mission of tonight's class is to give inspiration in that project and to give some information of what happens in the synagogue. So turn it over and over, for everything is in it. In the last class, we spoke a bit about blessings. So I wanted to begin tonight's little presentation with introducing the blessing for Torah study, which we say every morning. And this is the way the Torah, the blessings for Torah study appears in the Koren Sachs Siddur, which I recommended. And was remarking with a congregant this week about the beautiful type, the beautiful font that appears in this book. The blessing of the Torah, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'dvrei Torah. Praised are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy through his commandments and has commanded us to engage in study of the words of Torah. And the blessing continues with this, please, Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths and in the mouths of your people, the house of Israel, so that we, our descendants and their descendants, and the descendants of your people, the house of Israel, may all know your name and study your Torah for its own sake. Baruch atah Adonai hamlamed Torah li'amo Israel. Blessed are you, Lord, who teaches Torah to his people Israel. And it truly is through the study of Torah that we feel the connections, not just to Jews around the world, but to our past, and God willing, to the future. Because we want to do, when we say a blessing for the commandment, we want to do the commandment right away. We say we want the timing of the blessing to be right on the time that we do the commandment. So immediately after saying this blessing, we study a little bit of Torah, and we study a piece of Torah from the books of Moses, from the Torah itself, and we study a passage from the Mishnah, and we study a passage from the Talmud. And the study from the Torah that we do is a very famous passage, the priestly blessing. May the Lord bless and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and grant you peace. This is the priestly blessing that we say at the end of every Amidah. And we follow that with a passage from the Mishnah. These are the things for which there is no fixed measure. The corner of the field, that's when we leave a corner of the field for the poor. With the Torah, we're not told how much, we're just supposed to do it. Giving the first fruits, appearances before the Lord, coming to Jerusalem on the festivals, acts of kindness. There's no limit to the acts of kindness one is commanded to do. We're commanded to be kind as much as we can be. And the study of Torah, there's no fixed limit to the study of Torah. Every bit of Torah study is precious, and we're encouraged to do as much as we can. And finally, we finish with a little bit of Talmud. These are the things whose fruits we enjoy in this world, but whose full reward awaits us in the world to come. Honoring parents, acts of kindness, arriving early at the house of study morning and evening, hospitality to strangers, visiting the sick, helping the needy bride, attending to the dead, devotion and prayer, bringing peace between people. But the study of Torah is equal to all of them. This is how cherished the mitzvah of Torah learning was for the sages, that they put it against all of these great commandments, all of these things we should be doing. But the Torah study is also something very precious, and we're not permitted to neglect it. The Torah, in its most limited sense, the 5 books of Moses, are read publicly in the synagogue. And this is a defining aspect of Jewish worship. We believe that the Torah was given to Israel as a community, whether we accept it as history or not, the story tells us that all of the people were standing beneath Sinai when the Torah was delivered. And that's why we can only read the Torah publicly when there's a minyan in a public service. And we read it at various times during the week and on festivals. On Shabbat afternoon, on Monday and Thursday mornings, we read the first segment of the full weekly reading. We just read the beginning. It's usually about between 15 and 20 verses. So to sort of whet our appetite for the weekly reading, but also we don't like to go too many days in a row without the public reading. It's considered bad for us not to have the experience of Torah for too long. When obviously we still live in disrupted times. When the pandemic came and we ceased, like most communities ceased to read the Torah publicly, it was a tremendous I can't even begin to describe how crushing it was. If you had told me in January of 2020 that we were going to go almost a year without the public reading of the Torah together, I would have assumed that it was because I'd be dead. That's the only way that I would consider it happening. God willing, we're rebuilding and recontinuing, but this is a big part of the observant Jewish lifestyle, coming to synagogue to hear the Torah read as often as we can. We read the Torah on the festivals, and it's a portion that relates to the festival. And on Shabbat morning, we read what's the full weekly portion. And I'm going to describe later what the full weekly portion is. How do we find it? But this is what we call the parashah. And so every Shabbat has a name, a parashah. The coming Shabbat is the Shabbat Vayishlach. And that's because the first word of the portion that we read on Saturday morning is Vayishlach Yaakov, and Jacob sent. And so the Shabbat morning reading, some congregations do the full Monty, which generally would take about 40 minutes for a efficient reader to make it through. We do an abbreviated reading in our synagogue, as many synagogues do. We do about a third, which cuts the reading time, not by 2/3, but it cuts it by about half. And that's and this varies from community to community. We have this institution in the synagogue called Aliyah, and Aliyah just means to go up and to ascend. And when somebody moves to the land of Israel, when there's moved from the United States, I'm going to live in Israel, that's called making Aliyah, because we consider Israel to be the place where Jews are supposed to be. We're ascending to the heights that we belong. So we call going to move to Israel making Aliyah. But we also call an Aliyah the ceremony that we have on Saturday mornings and on the weekdays. On the weekdays, we have 3 of them. And on Shabbat, 7 people are called for the Aliyah. And the task of the person who was called up for the Aliyah traditionally was to read that section of the Torah. That when the Talmud discusses the practice, it doesn't say, and who's the person who's going to come up and say the blessings. It's understood that the person who's being called up is going to read a certain section of the Torah. As as things move on, the most communities have, and many communities have had for a long time, hundreds of years, professional readers, so that the person who has the honor of the Aliyah does not have to read the portion themselves. And the Aliyah refers to, in our understanding, the act of coming up and saying the blessing over the Torah, very similar to the one that we just read before. And this is considered to be a great honor, and it's considered to be an example of how we rely on each other to fulfill mitzvot. It's a team effort. It's the idea is not to have one person up there who does everything. We do this as a community, and we recognize the community's stake in learning and reading Torah through this system of aliyot. And I see some messages on the chats, and yes, Brian, Rabbi Schechter. How are people chosen for the Shabbat service Aliyah? So we have in synagogues these people called Gabbayim. Gabbai just means like an authority figure. And the Gabbais run the service, and the Gabbais assign Aliyot. The Olim, the people that have Aliyot are chosen. We really try to just spread it around as much as possible. There are certain constraints in a traditional synagogue such as our own. The first Aliyah is given to somebody of Kohanic descent, somebody who can trace their ancestry, somebody who can identify their ancestry with the priestly family of Aharon. They get the first one. And the second Aliyah is given to somebody who is can trace their ancestry to the tribe of Levi. So those you have some. There are fewer degrees of freedom in a traditional synagogue with the first 2 aliyot, but after that, it's a matter of just deciding who hasn't had one for a while and who would like one. If somebody has a special occasion, a wedding is coming up, or if they're becoming bar mitzvah, or there's something to mark it, it's appropriate to mark it by giving them an Aliyah, so the community can share in the simcha and can share in the celebration. This is the institution of the Aliyot. The scroll itself, and I invite anyone who wants to hang around with me after services on any Shabbat and wants to come up and take a close look at the scroll, to hang out with me, and I'll show you the scroll and neat things about the scroll. This is just a photograph of a scroll, and it's the Torah scroll is made of compressed animal hide. That's from a kosher animal, from a cow. It's pressed into parch. It's pressed into, we call it cloth. I don't know what the English translation of that would be. It is written by hand by a scribe who writes it with a quill and who writes it with a die, which is the instructions for making it have been passed down from generation to generation. The shape of the paragraphs, the way that the paragraphs are arranged are traditional, and they look mostly the same. There are some differences in scribal practices between Ashkenazi scribes from Northern Europe, and Sephardic scribes from the Mediterranean basin and in the land of Israel, but they're not huge. You have to be an expert to discern them. The process of writing a Sefer Torah takes roughly a year. It takes roughly a year for a trained scribe to write one. And at the top of the market, maybe 20 years ago, a brand new Sefer Torah would be about $50,000. When you think about it, this is what the guy did for that year, and it has to be at a level that the person's going to be able to eat and live indoors. They do a few Megillah, they do some Esther scrolls too to make a little extra money. But the Torah scroll is a precious investment for the congregation. We take very good care of them. We don't touch the scroll with our bare hands. If we need to touch it, there's a pointer that we use, and the expense of making one and the preciousness of them, we are extremely careful with the Sefer Torah that we have. Our community, we're lucky. I wish we weren't so lucky. We have a lot of scrolls from communities that don't exist anymore. We have like 9 scrolls, and half of them are scrolls that we've inherited from communities that have shut down. But these things are treasures. And as I said, there's a standing invitation of anyone who's in synagogue after Shabbat just to say, I want to look at the scroll with you, and I'd be delighted to. I'd be delighted to show the scroll to you. The writing on the scroll, I have here on the left panel of the screen. You can see the way that, and this is from this week's Parshiyot. So I was able to practice while preparing the class. So it was multitasking. The panel on the left is the way that the writing appears in the scroll. And this is simply called stam, which means simple. As it has no adornment. There's no punctuation. There's nothing to indicate vowel quality or vowel length. Now, that sounds intimidating until you actually learn Hebrew, and you realize that Hebrew does not have a really complicated vocalic system. There's only really 3 vowels. And when you consider how regularly inflected the language is, reading Hebrew without vowels is really not that difficult. But there are ambiguities. And we want the scroll, we want it to be read correctly. And sometimes you might not have access to somebody. If you have a question, you might not have access to somebody who can tell you what the received pronunciation is. And so we've developed a set of aids to help us read the Torah. And you can see that if you look at the right hand panel. The dots that are in black, in the little crosses and those things, it's basically dots in lines. Those are what are called nikudot. And nikudot just means dots. And these marks indicate the vowel quality and the length. So you can look at this without a teacher nearby, and if you know the system, you can figure out what the required pronunciation is for a text. There's another level of hints that are given, and these on this thing I put in color. So they're brown, they're red, and they're green. And these are the ta'amei hamikra, or ta'amim, which simply mean flavors. And these give you syntax, and they provide the punctuation of the verse. But they're also associated generally with a melody. We love to sing the Torah. We have this concept in Judaism called hidor mitzvah, making the mitzvah beautiful. And so rather than just reading it, Uvnei, Bilhah, Shivkat, Rachel, Adan, Naphtali, we sing it a little bit. Uvnei, Bilhah, Shivkat, Rachel, Adan, Naphtali. And it's the music that's attached to the ta'amim varies from community to community. The melody I just sang was an Ashkenazi German melody, which is probably the one that's used in most synagogues. But if I did it in a Sephardi melody, it would sound different, but it would the syntax, the divisions, the pauses would be the same. So these are the things that teach us how to read the scroll. But when we actually read it, we're only looking at the right hand panel. We don't have access to those. And which raises in the mind an important question: why don't we just write down the vowels? It would not be scribally. I mean, those vowels didn't always exist, is one answer, I suppose. Those diacritical marks came into being around the year 900 in Tiberias, and they're called the Tiberian tradition. But so we didn't do it all the time. But so why don't we write a Torah scroll now with those things on there? Wouldn't it be a lot easier? It would be a lot easier. You wouldn't have to study at all if you knew the system. You could just come into the synagogue and do it. As it is to study for a third of it, and I'm somebody who's been reading the Torah now for 25 years, I spend roughly 2 hours looking at it and making sure that I remember it correctly. I've been doing it for a long time, so when I know 90% of it just without working, but quality is important. I spend some time on that final 10%. But if we had the vowels, I wouldn't have to study at all. Why don't we do that? And I think that there's a deep answer in that there's an orality in our tradition that is so important. We are very suspicious of learning that happens through books rather than through people. And that the Masorah, the transmission of these things is precious to us, but the mode of transmission is precious as well. And so to preserve the oral tradition, that there's simultaneously a written tradition that is just the letters themselves, but there's an oral tradition of how the letters are read and how the text is parsed, and preserving the instrument of learning from teacher to student, I feel is so important. And it's preserved. It's preserved by the fact that we do not write down these marks in the scroll that would allow us to simply read the scroll without listening to other people, without listening to our teachers read it first. Let's see how I'm doing right on time. So another piece of of orientation in the synagogue that's very important to keep in mind is something called the Haftorot. Last summer, when we studied Jewish literature, we talked about the Tanakh, and we talked about how the Tanakh is a composite text, that there's the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, there's the Nevi'im, the prophets, which is the history of Israel, and the writings of the literary prophets, and the Ketuvim, which are the poetic and the philosophical works of the Bible. We have the tradition of, after we read the Torah, to read a small section, not as long as the Torah reading. If we're doing the triennial, the Torah reading is about 50 verses. If we're doing the full Kriya, the Torah reading is about 150 verses. A Haftorah, unless something terrible has happened, is not going to be longer than 20 verses. And so it's a shorter section, but it's a section from the prophets, and it is usually chosen to refract the weekly Torah portion. It's designed to spin our understanding of the portion in a certain direction, sometimes to negate a mistaken impression somebody might have of it. And so the Haftorah has to be considered at some level to be a level of rabbinic commentary, not because the rabbis wrote the Haftorot. They didn't. The Haftorot are older than the rabbis. The Haftorot were written by the prophets. But the rabbis decided which section of the prophets should be read with each section of the Torah. And by making that association, they're able to make a statement about how the Torah is to be understood. And it's traditional to honor, we honor a person every week with the opportunity to read from the prophets. Very common for the bar or bat mitzvah. And in the spring, we'll get to life cycle events, and we'll talk about the B'nai Mitzvah. But it's very basically, it's when a Jewish child comes of age, when they're 12 and a half or 13. And some of the ways that we mark that is by giving them the honor on the occasion of their 13th birthday to chant the Haftorah. And boy, are they happy to have that honor. As I mentioned earlier, there are the Torah. Every week has a every weekly portion of the Torah has a name. There are 54 of them, and I know this is in Hebrew, but it doesn't actually make sense if you try to transliterate stuff like this. But you can see there are 5 columns in the table, and under each of the columns there's a list of the Parshiyot for that are in that book. So you're going from right to left: Bereshit, Genesis, Shmot is Exodus, Vayikra, Leviticus, Bamidbar, Numbers, Devarim is Deuteronomy. And these are the listing of the Torah portions that we read throughout the year. Now there are 54 of them. The Jewish calendar does not always have 52 weeks in it like the Gregorian calendar, because it's not completely solar. There's an average of 52 weeks a year in the Jewish calendar, but it can vary from 54, from 56, 50. I don't know the exact range, but it varies. But even if there are enough weeks, there are Shabbatot, there are weekends when we can't do the regular portion because it's a holiday. And when it's a holiday, we don't do the regular portion. So we always end up doubling up some of the parshas. And so when you hear the Gabbai say, it's a double portion this week, they just mean that this is the week that we're doing 2, because we have to cram 54 of these into a year that's usually 52 or fewer weeks to do. But this is year, we go through the cycle, and it's when I meet somebody who comes to visit and I'm talking about their experience, and they say, well, I became bar mitzvah in this shul, and I'll say, so what was your portion? And they'll say, oh, it was Pinchas. So that we mark the week. We mark the week in accordance to what the Torah portion was that was being read. We have like a tool such as the Siddur, as we spoke a bit about last week. The Siddur is the compilation of Jewish prayer. We have these books called the Chumash to help us navigate the Torah service. The Chumash is simply a printed edition of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that includes the Haftorot, and it's organized. It's organized according to the weekly reading. So at the beginning of the Torah reading, the Gabbai will say, this week we're doing Parshat Vayishlach. It begins on this page, and everyone can turn to that page and they can follow along in this book what the Torah reader is doing up on the bima. And usually there's some pretty good commentaries there. So if you get bored with the Torah reading, if you get bored following along, your eyes can drift over to, you can drift to the bottom of the page and you can read a little bit about the Parsha. There are in liberal synagogues 3 main chumashim in Hebrew that are widely used, and I have pictures of them here. On the far left is the Eitz Chaim, which is the sort of the modern conservative movement one. It's what we call the new Chumash. It's only been out for 25 years or so. The middle one is the industry standard for more than a century now, the Hertz Chumash, and this is not really a denominational Chumash. You find it both in Orthodox, in traditional shuls. It's very commonplace, and the commentary is fine. It's very nice. It's a little bit dated, but whoever tires of a classic, I know I don't. And on the far right is the Gunther Platt Chumash, which is, I think it is more denominational, but it's there for everyone to learn from. It's a more modern-oriented commentary, which has been used widely by the Reform movement. I think that all 3 of these have much to recommend. I really don't like to give negative recommendations. I don't like to discourage people from finding out on your own and learning. And I'd rather just give positive recommendations. There is in Orthodox and Haredi circles the Art Scroll Stone Chumash, which is it has its moments, but I can't recommend it for beginners. It's simply we could talk about it in the question and answer session if we needed to, but it is something that I would probably avoid until later on in your learning, and then you can go to it and you can decide whether it's for you or not. I don't think it's a good entry level Chumash. And the rest is commentary. This is the famous, the famous story in Talmud Shabbat. Hillel is challenged by a proselyte that says, "Convert me on the condition that you can, tell me the entire Torah while standing on one leg." And Hillel was the second person that the proselyte went to ask this. The proselyte first went to Shammai and said, "Convert me on the condition that you can tell me the entire Torah while standing on one leg." And Shammai got out the 2x4 and threatened to beat him up. And so he went to Hillel, who was nicer. And Hillel answered the question, and he said, "Do not do to other people that which you would find disagreeable if done to you. That is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and study." Well, commentary is so precious. Commentary is what makes up the wonder of Torah. And I have reproduced here some pages from the Rabbinic Bible. It actually does not look that great now that it's in PowerPoint. But if there's 2 pages, the Torah is only just the little corner in the little top right corner on the top right side of little tiny bit. The rest of it is just commentary. The rest of it are the commentaries that have been written about it. And I want to talk, the last thing I'm going to speak about tonight, I want to talk about how Jewish Bible commentary is a little bit different than Bible commentary in other areas, and just give a general introduction to some things that you might hear about. The major difference between one of the major differences between Bible study among Jews and Bible study and other, well, particularly in Christianity, is that even in 2021, the commentaries that we rely on as the central commentaries were written in the Middle Ages. That the Rabbinic Bible, that the Jewish study Bible is a medieval work. And there's some historical reasons for that, but the main reason for that is that we've never departed from the language of Hebrew. And that because everything is written in Hebrew, if you wanted to go through Christian commentaries to an English Bible, I mean, you're reading the Bible in English. The commentaries of Augustine are in Latin. The Greek fathers are writing in Greek. The commentaries are not all in the same language. They're not in the same language that the text is written. If you can read Rabbinic Hebrew, and I think anyone who works at it can read Rabbinic Hebrew, you can read every Jewish commentary. From the rabbis of the Talmud through the Middle Ages, through the modern commentaries that are being written today in the land of Israel. And because of that continuity of Hebrew, we don't have to forget about commentaries simply because they're old. We've managed to maintain them. And the three central commentaries that we read, that we cite, that you'll hear rabbis talk about when rabbis give a sermon, well, this is what Rashi says, or this is what Ibn Ezra says. These big three are all from the Middle Ages, but they represent very diverse points of view. The first among equals and commentaries, the first commentary that Jewish children learn in the traditional setting is the commentary of Rashi, Shlomo ben Yitzchak, who lived in Ashkenaz, what we call France in Germany in the 11th century. And his commentary is an incredible encyclopedia of rabbinic learning and relating it to the Hebrew Bible. Rashi lived in a time with great tensions between the tiny Ashkenazi Jewish community and the surrounding Christian world. And he wanted to write a commentary that would give his readers ammunition to resist the teachings of their Christian neighbors, to resist efforts to convert, efforts to proselytize them, to make sure that the Jew who had his commentary in his hands would know what his tradition was. And it's a beautiful commentary. I think it was one of the first books ever published in Hebrew. And it's a classic. There have been thousands, and the way that it works is that if you have, it's not everybody can write a commentary on the Torah itself, but you could write a commentary on Rashi. And so this is, Rashi itself becomes a text that people write comments on. And there are over 1,000 commentaries on Rashi's commentary to the Torah. And these are called super commentaries. And this shows how the tradition of commentary is spread. The second of the big three is somebody who is completely different than Rashi, different in just about every way that he could be different. He was not Ashkenazi, he was Sephardi. He was born in southern Spain, in Al-Andalus. He was exiled from Spain in the same persecution by Muslims that Maimonides fled. Maimonides fled to Cairo. Ibn Ezra did not go to Cairo. He went to Northern Europe. And he lived out his life trying to teach the Ashkenazim, who he looked at as being basically ignorant, the wisdom of the Sephardi world, their tradition of philology, the fact that they knew Arabic helped them understand Hebrew better. It's a sister language, and the tradition of science and philosophy that was cultivated on the Iberian Peninsula. The commentary of Avraham ibn Ezra, it's a philological commentary that can be consulted with profit today as a scientific contextual commentary of the Torah and the Hebrew Bible. And so that's the second of the big three. And he knew about Rashi's commentary, and he makes fun of Rashi at little points in it. He did not have a lot of respect for Ashkenazim, including their great leader Shlomo ben Isaac. The third of the big three, Ramban, Moses ben Nachman, not Rambam, not Maimonides, Nachmanides. Ramban is sort of an amalgam. He's in Christian Spain. He has at his fingertips both the heritage of the Sephardi world and the best learning of Ashkenazi world. He knows both about the philosophical tradition of Maimonides, and he knows about the anti-Maimonidean schools. He knows about the mystical explosion that occurred in southern France and was being distributed throughout the northern part of Spain, what would go on to be called the Kabbalah. And so his Torah commentary, which again knows both Rashi and Ibn Ezra in response to them, tends to deal with matters of philosophy and mysticism. And these are the big three, but these are just the first three of a tradition of Torah commentary that begins in the Middle Ages, explodes throughout the Middle Ages, and continues to our very day. I mean, Torah commentaries and super commentaries continue to be written. And the effect of this, this diversity of voices, really a cacophony of voices, when we just open up a very basic volume of Jewish learning. What the Torah commentaries do, and it takes us back to where I began, I turn it over and over. Everything is in it. It's through the commentaries that we attach the multitude of Jewish voices across time to the text. It's through the commentaries that we experience how the Torah was read by Ashkenazim that were small in number but bold in their defense of their faith, how the Torah was read by the great philologists and scientists of Sepharad, how the philosophers and the mystics understood it. And the Torah really becomes something bigger than the text that is in it. The Torah functions in this way as an index for Jewish civilization, that our great teachings of mysticism and philosophy, law, and rabbinics, they are in these commentaries organized according to the Parshiyot. And whenever we look through it, we hear the diverse voices, and we get an experience of how big it is. And we start to hopefully believe, along with Ben Bagbag, that we turn it over and over, for everything is in it. Look into it, become gray and old therein. Do not move away from it, for you have no better portion than it. It is indeed a precious legacy. And I hope that there's 45 minutes. That's not bad. I hope that this little lecture helped open some doors and inspired some questions for that. And with that, I will open things up for discussion and for questions.
I just have a short story. One year I happened to be in Berlin on Rosh Hashanah, and I made arrangements to go to shul in Berlin. So I'm sitting there before the service starts, and this guy comes up to me and hands me a block of wood with a Hebrew letter engraved on it. And I'm thinking, what the heck is this? What, am I supposed to do something, or what is it? Well, the guy sitting in front of me turns around and he says, this means you have the third Aliyah. And the engraved letter was Shin, which is 3 in Hebrew. And he says, I'll tell you when it's time for you to go up on the bima. But it was kind of them to give me an Aliyah. And it was a strange custom with the block of wood that I'd never encountered before.
That's a great custom. At the Hampton Synagogue, we gave out gold bars. not actual gold-plated bars. It was I don't think we had letters. I think it had a dollar value on it. But having an Aliyah is a great honor, and I mean I recognize that there are some people here who are in the process of conversion and therefore aren't eligible for Aliyot. But when the process is over, you'd be welcome to have one, and we'll teach you how to do it. And people who are Jewish and have a hesitation about going up and doing it, I would just encourage you to be in touch with me, and I would. We could go to the sanctuary ourselves. No one's there. Practice it a few times. It really is an important honor and an important mode of participation for all of us. For all of us.
I bought myself an art scroll because it was so pretty. What's the danger?
You got the stone Chumash?
Yeah.
Oh, it was written by maniacs. It was just no there's no sense of, I mean, basically there's no sense of history to it.
Right.
It does not recognize that there are different really ages, or there's textures of Jewish history. Everything is presented as though it's what's a synchronic, and the approach that's needed is one that's diachronic, that recognizes that the rabbis are different throughout the ages, and that the Torah is read differently throughout the ages. It's I mean, as a working Chumash, it's a working Chumash. It's fine, but I just think that the commentary to it is. And again, I'm speaking as somebody. I do not like to steer people away from things, because I think people should experience as much as they can, and people can make up their own minds. And whenever people tell me, "Oh, you don't do this book, it's crazy," I that's when I go and I buy the book. Honestly, that's the. But because it's expensive, and because I simply think that there are much better things for somebody that's starting out to do, I make an exception to my general policy of tolerance in this case. Brian has a stone Chumash.
I do. It's my deployment Chumash. I used to all over the world with me. My mother-in-law got me the Gutnick edition, which has a lot of commentary from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and that one's horribly esoteric. And I share your sentiments about the Stone edition. I really do. It's cumbersome and without really good historical commentary. But this Gutnick one is just so esoteric in its commentary that it's, but it's still beautiful. I mean, it's
still Torah. It's still Torah. That's it counts as Torah. Is weekly Torah study intended to be always public, or is it okay to study on one's own? It's important to study on one's own. That's when we do our best learning. The Talmud has an instruction on studying the text that's very interesting. It says that a person should prepare for the reading by reading every verse in the weekly portion twice beforehand, and reading it once in translation. And so it's a balance, and this is something that everyone is expected to do individually before they come to school, come to synagogue on Shabbat. And the idea is that the actual reading of it, the precise pronunciation in the text is very important, but we're always required to try to put it into other words. It's never enough to just memorize and to recite, but we're required to study it in translation in order to expand the way that we think about it. And so the question arises, what do you do if you only know Hebrew? And so the answer is you have to learn at least one language besides Hebrew to learn it. So you have to, traditionally they would do it in Aramaic as well, but we're required to try to take the Torah out of the language that it's in and put it into different words, because that's where Torah lives. If there's nothing else, are you sure there's nothing else? Well, I thank you for joining me this evening. I look forward to our discussion on kashrut in a few weeks. And those people who live nearby are invited to come to our public Torah reading in Bangor on Saturday. Those who are not nearby are invited to seek out public Torah readings that they can travel to, and to experience a little bit what we spoke of tonight. I hope tonight's words were helpful. Shavua Tov.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.